On a gray November morning in 2010, inside a packed press room in Hannover, Germany, four men sat behind a long table and prepared to end one of the greatest rock stories ever told. Camera flashes lit up the walls. Reporters leaned forward with pens hovering over notebooks. And Klaus Meine, the voice that had carried Scorpions across 5 decades, looked into the lights and said the words no fan wanted to hear. This would be the band's very last tour. Ever. A hush fell over the room, then a wave of murmurs. After the shock settled, one question hung over everything like smoke. Why now, at the height of a comeback, with a new album climbing charts around the world? The real answer, Klaus would only admit years later, involved something far more personal than fame or fortune. It involved a secret fear about his own voice, a fear born in a hospital bed 6 years earlier, when doctors told him he might never sing again. But the story of the Scorpions' farewell would not end the way anyone in that room expected. Years after the tears, the goodbyes, and the final bow that fans traveled continents to witness, this band would do something almost unheard of in rock history. They would walk back into the light, pick up their instruments again, and prove that some fires simply refuse to go out, no matter how many times the band themselves tried to put them out. To understand why 4 men in their 60s would choose to end a career at its peak, you have to go back to a night in 2004, long before any farewell was ever discussed. Klaus Meine stood in a recording booth, opened his mouth to sing, and nothing came out the way it should. Polyps had formed on his vocal cords, a brutal and common danger for singers who had spent a lifetime pushing their voices to the limit, night after night, arena after arena. Doctors warned him that another surgery gone wrong, another year of strain, could silence him permanently. For a man whose entire identity was built around that unmistakable rasp and power, the warning cut deeper than any critic's review ever could. He had surgery. He recovered. He sang again. But something in him changed that year. He began to understand, in a way he never had before, that his voice was not an unlimited resource. It was borrowed time. Rudolf Schenker, the band's founder and driving force since 1965, watched his friend wrestle with that fear for years afterward. The two men had built Scorpions from a small German club act into one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, survivors of the Cold War stage, icons behind anthems like Wind of Change and Rock You Like a Hurricane. Neither wanted to watch the story end in decline, with a diminished voice and half-empty arenas. They wanted, more than anything, to leave while the crowd was still on its feet. So the decision was made quietly, months before the world knew. In early 2010, Scorpions released an album called Sting in the Tail, and inside the liner notes and interviews, careful readers could sense something final in the language, something more reflective than promotional. Then came the November press conference, the cameras, the stunned silence. The tour would be called the Final Sting World Tour, and it would take the band across 6 continents over roughly 3 years, a farewell on a scale almost no other rock act had ever attempted. Reporters asked Klaus directly if this was a stunt, a marketing angle to sell tickets. He shook his head slowly and said it was real, that they wanted to go out with dignity, on their own terms, while they could still deliver the shows fans deserved. Rudolph added that they had watched too many legendary bands limp toward retirement, embarrassing themselves in front of audiences who remembered them at their peak. Scorpions did not want that fate. They wanted one last unforgettable ride, city by city, country by country, ending the story on a note as powerful as the one that had opened it 45 years earlier in a smoky Hannover rehearsal room. The tour began in late 2010, and almost immediately something electric happened. Ticket demand exploded far beyond what anyone in the band's camp had projected. Fans who had seen Scorpions once in 1988 or twice during the Wind of Change years, when the song became an unofficial anthem for a crumbling Berlin Wall and a changing world, suddenly felt an urgent, aching need to see them one final time. Parents brought their grown children. Old friends who had lost touch for decades reunited outside arena doors, wearing faded tour shirts from concerts 30 years gone. In Russia, where Wind of Change had taken on almost mythical meaning as the Soviet Union collapsed, the emotion in the crowd was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of voices singing every word back at the stage, many with tears streaming down weathered faces. Klaus later described standing at the microphone in Moscow, looking out over that sea of people, and feeling his throat tighten with something that had nothing to do with vocal strain. It was grief, arriving early, for something that had not even ended yet. Matthias Jabs, the band's longtime guitarist, said the shows themselves felt different that first year, charged with an intensity born from knowing every performance in every city might be the very last time they played there. In Berlin, older fans stood outside the venue hours before doors opened, trading stories about where they were the first time they heard Wind of Change crackle out of a radio, back when the wall itself was still standing, and such a song felt almost like defiance. Backstage, road crew who had worked with the band since the 80s found themselves quietly emotional too, packing amplifiers and coiling cables with a tenderness that had not been there on ordinary tours, aware that each city crossed off the schedule was one less chance to do this particular job again. As the tour rolled on through 2011 and into 2012, the band found themselves living inside a strange paradox. Every night they were saying goodbye, and every night they felt more alive than they had in years. Life on the road, the thing that was supposedly wearing them down, began to feel less like a burden and more like oxygen. Rudolf Schenker, now in his 60s, would later admit that the farewell tour reignited something in him he thought had gone dormant, a raw hunger for the stage that reminded him of being a teenager in post-war Germany, dreaming of rock and roll on a stolen transistor radio. Backstage, conversations began to shift. What had once been solemn talk of endings slowly turned into something else entirely. Someone would mention a new riff they had been working on. Someone else would laugh and say they should be careful, because ideas like that were exactly how bands ended up breaking their own promises. It was said as a joke, at first, tossed around dressing rooms in Tokyo and Sao Paulo and Cape Town. But jokes repeated often enough start to reveal something true underneath them. Klaus's voice, meanwhile, was holding strong, night after grueling night, defying the very fear that had started the entire farewell in the first place. The man who thought he might lose his instrument forever was instead delivering some of the most powerful performances of his career, and everyone around him could hear it. By 2012, the so-called final tour had already outlived its own name once. What was supposed to wrap in a year or two kept finding new legs, new continents, new demand that the band could not bring themselves to refuse. Management extended the schedule, then extended it again. Longtime fans began to notice a curious pattern, a kind of open secret nobody in the band would confirm out loud. Interviews grew more careful, more hedged. Where Klaus had once spoken with total certainty about retirement, he now used softer language, words like, "for now," and "we'll see how it feels." A German entertainment journalist pressed Rudolph directly in early 2013, asking whether the farewell was truly final. Rudolph paused for a long moment before answering, and that pause said more than any quote that followed. Behind the scenes, the band had quietly begun booking studio time, not for a farewell record, but for something that felt unmistakably like a beginning. Nobody wanted to say the word out loud yet. Announcing a reversal after millions of fans had already paid for what they believed were final, once-in-a-lifetime tickets carried real risk, a risk of looking dishonest, of undermining the very emotion that had made the farewell tour so powerful in the first place. So the band sat with their secret, torn between the promise they had made the world and the fire they could feel building again inside themselves. The private turning point, as band members later described it, happened somewhere in a rehearsal space in late 2013, long after the official farewell dates had technically concluded. The four of them, plus longtime drummer James Kotak and bassist Pavel Makivoda, were running through old material simply to stay sharp, they told themselves, nothing more. But somewhere in that room, playing songs from decades earlier with no audience and no cameras, something shifted. Rudolph later said it felt less like rehearsal and more like remembering who they actually were underneath the farewell narrative they had built for the public. Klaus, whose voice had carried the fear that started this entire chapter, realized in that room that the thing he had been most afraid of losing had never actually left him. If anything, 3 years of grueling touring had proven the opposite of what he feared. His instrument was intact. His hunger was intact. The only thing that had truly ended was a decision made in a different emotional moment, years earlier, under different circumstances. Sitting with his bandmates, men he had known since the 1970s, brothers through fame and obscurity and every version of rock and roll's changing fortunes, Klaus began to wonder if walking away from the stage while everything still worked was actually its own kind of mistake. In 2015, Scorpions made an announcement that stunned longtime fans in a way few bands ever managed twice. They were releasing a new studio album titled Return to Forever, and they were going back on tour. There was no dramatic press conference this time, no room full of cameras bracing for shocking news. Instead, the announcement arrived through interviews and social media, almost quietly, as if the band understood that grand declarations had already been made once and did not need repeating. Fan reactions split instantly between two extremes. Some felt betrayed, remembering the emotional goodbyes they had given at farewell shows, the money spent on tickets sold as historic final chances, the tears shed believing they would never hear "Rock You Like a Hurricane" live again. Others felt something closer to pure joy, a disbelief that quickly turned into celebration, flooding forums and comment sections with messages that all said some version of the same thing: "We get them back." Klaus addressed the criticism directly in interviews, admitting the band had underestimated how deeply fans would hold them to the word final. He apologized for the confusion, but he never apologized for the decision itself. Life, he said, had simply proven bigger and stranger than the plans they had made for it in that Hannover press room 5 years earlier. What followed was not a brief victory lap, but an entire second act, one that in time would stretch on for well over a decade beyond the moment the band was supposed to have vanished from stages forever. Return to Forever became a genuine hit among longtime fans, filled with songs that echoed the classic Scorpions sound while acknowledging, in subtler ways, everything the band had just lived through. Tours followed across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, filling arenas with crowds who had, in some cases, already said their goodbyes once and now got to say hello all over again. There was something uniquely moving about those reunion shows, an emotional layer that new fans could never quite access. The people in those crowds had grieved this band already. They had stood in arenas years earlier, believing they were witnessing history's final chapter, only to discover the story kept writing itself. Klaus's voice, the very thing that had triggered the entire farewell in 2004, continued holding strong tour after tour, defying every original fear with each note he hit. Rudolf Schenker, well into his 60s and then his 70s, kept performing with an energy that seemed to mock the very idea of retirement altogether. Looking back now, the Scorpions' false farewell reveals something deeper than a simple change of plans or a broken promise to fans. It reveals the almost impossible bond between certain musicians and the stage itself, a bond so powerful that even a genuine, well-intentioned goodbye could not fully sever it. Klaus Meine went from a man terrified of losing his voice in a hospital bed to a man who, decades later, was still using that same voice to fill stadiums around the world. Rudolf Schenker, the founder who watched a small German club band become a global phenomenon, proved that the fire he lit back in 1965 was never truly extinguishable. Not by age, not by fear, not even by the band's own farewell tour. For fans who lived through both moments, the tearful goodbye of 2010 to 2013 and the joyful, unexpected return that followed, the story became something richer than either ending alone could have offered. It became proof that legends do not always get to choose a single, clean, final chapter. Sometimes the story simply refuses to end, and the band, much like the fans who never stopped loving them, discovers there was always one more song left to play.